Hello. Right, so my background is in telco branding, particularly from a global perspective. I spent over 12 years at Vodafone within the global brand team, building various branding strategies for our various operators across the world and our partner market operators across the world. I think at one time we had about 80 countries that we worked with and dealt with. I feel very honored to be here in Iceland. It is genuinely one of my favorite countries in the world because it feels like you're on the moon, which is really, really, really cool. And then the one thing that you probably wouldn't find if you Googled me is I have a fear of tomatoes in their recognizable form. So I'm fine with ketchup, I'm fine with sauce, but I can't have it if it looks like a bruschetta. Anyway, so back to my presentation and the reason we're here. So I wanted to center my thoughts around the power of perceptions, and particularly lessons from the telco world that perhaps might be of value in the energy branding world. I mean, I think there's a lot of synergies, and I do think there's a lot of similarities in our life cycle, and the way that we've developed as industries, and the way that we've sort of both had to be very privy to the needs of innovation, and where we've both been threatened by a rising tide of commoditization. So, one of the things that telco has slowly been subjected to is what I call the commoditization death trap, right? And that's a result of too many Me Too products, or too many products that have eroded differentiation. It's eroded a perception of value in the consumer. It's led to stiffened regulations, because obviously the regulators have cottoned on. And it has thus led to a budget reduction, less spending on innovation. And one of the things that first goes when you start commoditizing is spending on customer insight, which arguably should be the opposite. This has impacted budgets and has advanced the need to reduce costs, lower spending on innovation and R&D, which has led to fewer consumer options and, unfortunately, a focus on the wine and not the wine glass, the wine being the latest iPhone and the glass being what powers the iPhone. It's gone are the days where we used to say things like, I'm with Vodafone, or I'm with T-Mobile, where we sort of aligned our personal aspirations to the choice of network operator, at least in telco. And telco enjoyed that in its early days because it was so new. Now, I mean, look, geography obviously plays a part in this, and some countries less and some countries no. But consumers are less interested in it because they sort of have that very, oh, okay, who are you with? They're all the same. It doesn't really matter. And it does matter if you're working inside the industry. So, one of the turning points for us in the telco industry was in Finland. Now, I can't remember, it was 2000 and something. Telecommunications, or the right to communicate, was declared a fundamental human right. And this is a complete double-edged sword, but it was the penny drop moment for us that we were in trouble as an industry if we did not start to change. And we would fast forward to 20 years, and we'd just be promoting price. And it would be very, very difficult to draw a perceived value. Now in telco, and I imagine in energy it's quite similar, that is majorly impactful because it affects the bottom line, and it affects our ability to create margins or to regulate margins in our commercial activities. So the big question is, how do we drive value differentiation in industries where the product is seen as fundamental? And So I think that's Bjork. No, it's not. And one of the things that is now more important than ever is the power of great branding, coupled by singularity and effectively balancing long-term and short-term objectives to create a single-minded purpose, or housed within a single-minded purpose. And this is becoming incredibly difficult in what I call the age of distraction, right? And I believe we are living in the age of distraction. Now, this morning I wanted to replace the slide, but it was a bit late. I found a little video of a puppy that was looking at a leaf and then got distracted by a ball and then got distracted by its owner. And that is really how I feel that consumers and organizations are behaving. And that's why it is difficult to do this, because we're having CMOs that are increasingly having a shorter and shorter tenure. So when you as a brand team go into them and say, we want to create a 5-year engagement program that we sort of start seeding in the first year, then in the second year we start reaping some reward, but it only really kicks in from a profit perspective in 5 years, and they go to you, not interested, because in 5 years' time I'm going to be sunning myself in Saint-Tropez. So it's difficult, and one of the ways that sort of appeals, or I find as a mechanism to get things pushed through, or to highlight the importance of long-term objectives internally, is to balance them with short-term commercial pressures. So going, I can deliver this for you, but the trade-off is I feel that we should do these long-term activities too. And one of the neat ways of putting that all together is through the creation of a single-minded purpose. Now, by great branding, I don't mean putting lipstick on a pig. I mean creating a company-wide intent to be known for something that is meaningful and it reflects the true capabilities of the company, emotionally and rationally grounded in what matters to customers and not to product managers, and that is insight and benefit driven. So one of the key challenges in telco, particularly within the global team, was managing product managers who all felt that their product was the product of the year. And you kind of look at it and go, really? Is it? No. And that's why it's incredibly important to have macro oversight, or for somebody to have macro oversight against those priorities. And again, a single-minded purpose helps manage that, because if you say our single-minded purpose, for example, GSK's is to be a disease's greatest enemy, then what are you doing to deliver that? How is our communication calendar looking from a net perspective to delivering that? And that really helps go, okay, actually, this has got a little bit of a lower focus, therefore we'll only promote it in store, or we'll start testing it in one of our stores, or start testing it in one of our malls, and then we'll ramp it up. Or actually, it doesn't fit our single-minded purpose, it has a commercial value, therefore we are consciously, from an awareness perspective, going, okay, we're going to go after this, but we're not necessarily going to communicate it at large to the consumer, because we want to protect how they perceive us. And remember, in the age of distraction, it is really important to be mindful of that and to not confuse the customer, because every single opportunity that you have to talk to them is fleeting. And that's why consistency is king. And every single touch point needs to be treated as the only shot of telling your story. Because remember, we're not an Apple. People don't listen to us. They do not want to listen to us. The product is fundamental. They want you to be there. They want it to work, but they want you to go away. And that's a difficult, it is very difficult to entertain a conversation with somebody on that. And it becomes even more important to retain singularity in that context. So, Chapter 3. So how do we do this? So one of the things that we used to do in Vodafone when we used to go to our markets, particularly markets that were struggling, was to get them to create a blueprint for change. And that blueprint for change involved operations, internal, and the commercial engines, because it is absolutely invaluable that everybody is a part of a changing brand agenda, because if it is not, it will not lead to change. And again, then the branding team will be sort of pushed aside to the comms team. And brand is not comms. Comms is the output of brand. And brand starts by involving everybody in the conversation. So here is one of the things that this was sort of a 4-point plan that we had put together to find this this purpose. So number 1 is find your purpose, right? And go, and again, make it reflective of who you are as a company, not necessarily what's going on with the competition. If you're the smaller player in the market and what you have, because you've come late, is speed, but you don't have network, you don't have broad coverage, talk about speed. If you have innovation, talk about innovation. If you have a maverick sort of story because the CEO jumped out of planes and that's how he decided to do a network, then talk about that. Don't try to be somebody that you're not, because it will not work unless you're willing to, put swaths of money behind being somebody else. Set a change agenda that's with communication being the last thing that changes. And this is really important. Make it true before you communicate that it is true. And this is more. It's not necessarily more for a customer. It's actually more internal, because it tests whether a company actually is committed to changing, right? Because if you change around a single-minded purpose, that means your metrics change, which is really important, because there's no point in developing a purpose around X and then or a purpose around, say, becoming more lovable, and then everybody's judged from a metrics perspective on short-term sales. It's not going to work. You have to embed metrics of the purpose into your everybody's objectives. Think HR. Ask every single member of the organization to look at what the purpose is and what the change agenda is and what that means for them, because you'd be surprised how much has to change in order for it to become true. Appoint macro oversight to manage the net outtake from the customer about the company, a chief brand ambassador. Again, there needs to be somebody within the organization that manages the net output that goes to the customer. And this is, again, managing all of those priorities and keeping those product managers at bay. And when somebody says, I think we need to do a gender-specific branding, the answer is no. We don't do that. We don't create sub-brands or whatever it is, because there's somebody who's able to toe that line. Then lastly, find a communication format with internal comms that appeals emotionally but is rationally rooted. Left brain, right brain, not too corporate, not too flippant. And this is often what happens in telco, is when a new communication format comes out, often it can be too much on one or the other side of the spectrum. In other words, you have, these brand videos that are hyper-emotive with scenes of landscapes and interpretive dance and whatnot, and then the customer looks at it and goes, what? Is that Vodafone? I just want my phone to work. I don't want you to change my life. Thank you. Or it's too emotionally, or it's too rationally rooted. For example, I always remember when we had the brief to work with 3G HSBDA Plus, which sounds like something you get on a holiday in Magaluf. It didn't work. Rather, talk about 3G plus. That's just faster than normal 3G. So having that balance is really, really important, and fitting it within a communication format that identifies the branding cues. In other words, what is going to be absolutely and fundamentally consistent from a visual and tonal and emotional point of view, and then also what is our substantiation? What is the thing that is different from a rational perspective? So then the last one, and I know I'm running over time, so I'm just going to sort of whiz through it, is a case study that highlights that when this is done well, it can really, really make a difference to the organization and can help you actually fare bad weather. So this is sort of the story of Vodafone Hungary. Vodafone Hungary is the third player. It came in late to the market in terms of market share. And it's always struggled against the incumbent, because the incumbent obviously used to be the state-owned operator and had wads of cash and had a pre-existing infrastructure where we had to sort of build that, and it was just not economically viable to compete from an infrastructure perspective. So we had to. The challenge was, we know we're not the best, but how do we create the perception that we are the best, or that we have something that is better than the competition? So we rallied a purpose around speed, because it was the one thing that we had. We didn't really have the coverage, but we did have the speed. And we relentlessly talked about it for 3 years. So in other words, even if we were talking about price or we're doing a promotional gig, we put in a message about speed. In the call center, when you called them, there was a message about speed in the hold music. It was speed, 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 culminating to a series of events that we did with McLaren in Hungary, where we got a quarter of the population involved, called Raise Your Game, where we sort of, took a race car and went through towns, and we did speed-related activities, and we sort of took over everything from an experiential perspective. And obviously we did that with using the sort of the paid plus owned equals earned model. So using social media as a sort of a galvanizing point, but really propping that up with traditional media, so sort of balancing the two quite nicely. And what that resulted in was, when 4G was launched, we got the smallest spectrum at auction. And we had to launch a little bit later because we were investing in other markets, right? So we couldn't really put a focus on Hungary. But because we had done such a good job of branding consistently and rallying the company around a consistent purpose, people thought we had 4G, because they just assumed speed, Vodafone, therefore they obviously have 4G. And we recorded higher 4G awareness levels than our competitors, despite actually not having 4G. And this, obviously, reality caught up to perception, but at least it bought us some time, and it mitigated the risks of being sort of left behind in the market by two very aggressive incumbents. And sort of one of the last things that was really helpful was a CEO that was not too trigger happy. In other words, chasing the competition. Rather than focusing on what the competition did, we constantly had the mandate to rewrite the rules and not just play into their hand. So we did things like, one year the traditional media calendar has a spike in media spend towards Christmas. We just brought that forward by a month and a half, and that sort of triggered a media war within the company, and that allowed us to have a sort of a one-up and erode their media spend for Christmas. So, it was a little bit of reeler-dealer. But that's where my presentation ends. Remember, perception is reality, and look at branding in a more holistic sense, and really look at it as the ability to manage perception And that ability to manage perception will only happen if the whole company gets involved and if brand is seen more than a communication output. Otherwise, it's just going to be short-term tactical plays that in 10 years' time, unfortunately, will erode value and send you down the sort of commoditization death trap. Thank you. Thanks.